One of the big advantages of working with couples in groups is that they hear other couples' stories, and it helps to know that they're not alone and that other couples struggle with some of the same issues that they do. So I've attended and I've led a number of small group Bible studies in my life, and some of them were great and some of them were not so good. I was once sitting in a Bible study and the leader asked for a prayer request. And one woman said, "I have an unnamed prayer request." At the time, I didn't think a lot about it. I was in my 20s, and I knew that she just wasn't comfortable sharing in the small group, something that was a personal issue for her. But then as I've thought back about that group, I think that we didn't really share much of anything that was personal. We just kind of talked about the Bible, and that's great and fine, but we didn't open up about our personal issues. A few years after this incident, a leader joined our church, same church, and he led a small group. And the very first time that we met, he came in, and the very first thing out of his mouth was, "I just had a terrible day today." And he talked about all of his feelings, about what had happened, and the challenges that he had run into. And he said, does anybody else have anything to say? And it was a really interesting dynamic, because when he became transparent, the group became transparent. And they started to open up a little bit. And after a few sessions of this, it became safe to talk about your personal struggles. And the group dynamic shifted and became much deeper. And we had some very intimate dialogue. The light bulb went on in my head. The group leader can set the tone for the dialogue. And I've come to realize it is much easier to heal when we are open and honest about our struggles. And as I moved into marriage ministry, I started to lead marriage ministry small groups. But this is kind of another level of challenge, because couples come from different places, and some just need a few tips, but others are struggling with really big things. The big issues may be deeply personal, and they're difficult to talk about. So how do we handle this? Well, the leader sets the tone. And my wife and I are very open in the first meeting. But let me kind of talk to you a little bit about some of the points that we'll typically cover. One, admitting that we've had problems in the past. We talk about how much we've struggled. We'll talk about the problems that we've had, the impact that it had on our marriage and our connection, and just acknowledging that we've had issues and what those issues are. It seems to help people, because they know that hey, we're not perfect people. I'll talk about how I didn't want to get help. And very common with couples, and I'll talk about I didn't want to. I just had this kind of sense of, failing, I guess. I felt like I should know what I'm doing, and I didn't want to admit to this or admit to the weakness. And then we'll talk about how we opened up to our small group, and that it helped us to be able to talk about the small group. And what we learned is that a lot of the couples there related to us, and they were able then to open up about their relationship struggles. And then we'll talk about how we improved, and we'll talk about specific steps we took, the realizations that we had to come to, and the areas that we had to work on. So we recommend that mentoring couples agree on what it is they're going to share. Don't surprise your spouse. Talk about, what can you share? Are there some personal things you don't want to talk about? And agree to it ahead of time. So we had mentor couples that we have trained. And, they'll say, well, I don't know that I want to talk about the affair that we had and how we recovered it. You recovered from it. And I'll say, well, then don't. I'm not going to force you to. That's not safety. And if you're not comfortable sharing something, then don't share it. But I do say, but I know that you'll set the tone for the transparency of the group. And what you share will help others to be able to share and to be open. Let's put some balance into this, though. Are you failing if the group doesn't open up? And we've had some groups that just never seem to really open up much. Michelle, my wife, and I lead a marriage group at our church, and we have trained a number of facilitator couples. And so there was a point when we emphasized transparency so much that we would look at that as kind of a measure of the effectiveness of our group. And we were talking about this one time at one of our leader debriefs. And we talked about, what about couples that don't share? Does that mean anything? And one of the facilitator couples said that, well, when they went through this, they didn't talk at all. And they didn't want to say much, and they didn't really feel like they had processed it. And the interesting part is that they had recovered from an affair. And after a year or so, they had healed enough that they were willing to talk about it. And they came back. We have a live class. They gave a testimony, the 70 people there. And they did this on more than one occasion. But I think they needed to just heal a little bit before they were able to really open up about it. And it reminds me that just because a couple doesn't open up does not mean that they're not getting a lot out of the group. So there are internal processors and external processors. And I'll explain this to the group. The internal processors kind of want to sit and think about it a little bit, and they think on their own. External processors want to talk about it out loud. And I'll even ask groups, I'll say, how many of you are external processors? And all the extroverts will raise their hand. And I'll say, that's fantastic, but I want to hear from everybody in the group. And so external processors, there might be a time if I feel you're dominating the group, I might just kind of say, I'd like to hear from everybody else. And internal processors, I might look at you and directly ask you a question, say, what's going on inside your head? But you are always free to say, I don't feel comfortable sharing right now. I just don't want to talk about it because I want safety inside of the group. So tips for marriage mentors. Be transparent. You set the tone. If you're not open, odds are your group won't be open. Don't judge your success by the amount that people share. You may be pleasantly surprised later to find out that some quiet people have just gotten a tremendous amount out of the group. And internal processors. Know that there are internal processors, and just because somebody is quiet doesn't mean they're not engaged, and it doesn't mean that they're not really thinking about it a lot. So those 3 tips again: be transparent. Don't judge your success by the amount that the people share, and know that there's internal processors. And some people just won't share. That does not mean they're not highly engaged in the group.